Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. It's all about Iran these days, isn't it? The country has said that on July the 7th, it will exceed the uranium enrichment limit, which had been set within the nuclear deal, the JCPOA. We, of course, know that the United States walked away from that deal not too long ago, but a significant amount of time ago. And since the time that the United States walked away from that deal, there has just been this campaign of maximum pressure, as the U.S. would term it, towards Iran. And Iran has not seen the benefits from this deal until now. And as, of course, the Europeans have been trying to come to terms with the United States walking away, are trying to, in their terms at least, bring forth a mechanism where they can trade with Iran, but that has, of course, not yet succeeded. Iran then reacting to all of that and saying it needs to stand up for itself and that it does have the right to, within this deal, temporarily at least, suspend some of the limits that it had placed on its uranium enrichment until such time that other parties live up to their end of the bargain. Let's discuss that all a bit further. We're joined now by Dr. Ilia, who is with the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Aberdeen in the UK. She's a reviews editor as well at the Journal of Global Fault Lines. She's joining us now from Aberdeen via Skype. Also joining us via Skype from Rome is Antonio Scaramella, who is a geopolitical analyst. Thank you both for joining us, Antonio and Ilia. Antonio, I'd like to start with you, if I may. There's been a lot of talk about what happens now. And now that Iran has made the decision, in some people's point of view for standing up for itself, or for other people's point of view for proving that it cannot be relied upon and that it does want nuclear weapons. What happens now? Do you think that we are headed towards an escalation war even possibly?
Well, escalation most likely is going to be one of the possible outcomes that we can see from the situation as it is. But I would not say that Iran did this because it wanted to stand up for itself. They are just checking on their allies and seeing how their international relations are developing. The European Union and the European allies of Iran in general were pretty silent in the last months. As you said, it's been quite some time since Trump denounced the treaty, and still nothing much happened in Europe. So they're trying to see how Europe will react to something like this. On the other hand, we have seen the US trying to see how the UK would react on their behalf when stopping an Iranian tanker in the Strait of Gibraltar. Yeah. So I see this as a moment in which the two are testing each other's strength. Escalation is possible because both actors are boxed in what has been their rhetoric in this past months. None of the two sides, given all the political pressure and economical pressure coming from the sanctions and Trump's policy, are willing at this point to just let go. They cannot let it go easily. Finding a way to peace now is complicated. But on the other hand, I still believe that if the Iranians are given at least some incentives to go back to the table, they will. Because even if they are very hard to defeat, of course, they don't want to go on an all-out war with the United States. I'm pretty sure.
On that point then, Antonio, Ilia, I want to ask you about that, in fact, because it's all about, in fact, giving Iran those incentives. Because it's clearly saying, listen, if you do something which convinces us to go back on this uranium enrichment, we'll do it. We're just doing this temporarily, and we want to remain within this deal. Do you think that Europe or the other signatories will be able to deliver on such an incentive?
Okay, thank you very much for the question and for inviting me back. I agree with Antonio's analysis, exactly what he's saying. Nobody actually, and especially Iran, wants to escalate these tensions to an all-out war. But let's sit back and understand the position that Iran has been for the last year. So the tensions haven't been risen today or the last week. It was Trump that actually challenged and withdrew unilaterally US from the agreement. So for the past year or so, Iran has been in a terrible position that there was little room actually to maneuver. So it was really not surprising, this, current moves that, the Iranian officials took. And actually, there wasn't any other space or any other room actually to move to. So
that's an interesting point, Ilia. If I may pick you up on, push you on that point made there, Ilia. I wonder, what we both have said, all of us have said, even Antonio have said, is that there is an understanding, there's a context to what Iran has gone through ever since the U.S. walked away from this deal. But it still seems, Ilia, that Europe is the one threatening Iran, in fact, saying that, listen, don't walk away from this deal. France has said that, the UK has said that, Germany has said that, don't walk away or else. Basically, I'm paraphrasing, of course, what they individually said. Why is it that there isn't this context that is being understood, that Iran has been under this pressure, and that the U.S., as one of the main signatories, just dumped this deal?
That's an interesting question, because actually what we see the last few days and weeks, that the European powers and European Union is, pointing the finger to Iran and asking not to withdraw and stay in this diplomatic path, to solve the issue. But at the same time, we have seen a disgraceful, position of the Europeans towards, the U.S. initiatives in the whole issue. So it is not only by the European powers to pressure Iran to stay on track with actually the agreement, but actually to take a more independent path and a more useful actually role to actually solve the issue.
So then, Antonio, in many ways then, something that Iran has pointed out too, as I'm sure you're aware, that this is really a test for Europe, isn't it? Because Russia and China, seemingly at least, are more allied with Iran and have said that they will still continue to deal with Iran, and they'll figure out ways to do that, be it for oil or other such trade. But then for the Europeans, as Ilia there pointed out as well, it's a test that can they stand up to the U.S.? What do you make of that? What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, this is definitely a complex and interesting question. Thank you for this. But still, I think that giving a clear answer is complicated, since the new commission just got in place. It's just there. So the European Union as a whole could take a while to figure out a new and more clear position on the matter. Yeah. I would go for something like 4 or 6 months. Europe is pretty slow. On the other side, definitely Europe has been in the past, decades, a political mice. Geopolitical Europe was basically non-existent. It was just, caring a little bit for the Mediterranean, not even too much. Now they are putting in this position, and in this position, they will have to decide whether they will stand to their principles, stand to what they signed, because that's what they actually signed, and also answer to the internal public in their own countries. Not much for the common general public, but I'm thinking more about entrepreneurs, industries that were promised that this kind of deal with Iran would not only bring more security in general, the area, and so on and so forth, but would open to them a huge potential market made of several million people, most of which are very young, very well educated. Yep. So, of course, on the other side, we have the Americans. And as we all know, NATO and America has been the watchdog of the world and surely the defender of Europe in the last decades. So I would say that we'll have to wait still for a couple more months for the new commission to adjust, and to the countries, of course, to adjust to what the commission and the new high representative will have to say before answering correctly this question. But on one side, I would not say that it's so easy for Europe to just relinquish the United States. That,
Indeed.
I'm afraid, would be very problematic.
Indeed, and on that point that Ilia, now, just if we're looking at EU-US relations, they're not always in the best of places, are they? Especially with the recent, again, threat by the US that it may add more tariffs onto EU products. In such a climate, then, will the EU be able to, do you think, stand up for itself, stand up for EU European businesses? We, of course, know that European airplane manufacturers, for example, had signed deals with Iran, and those deals have now, of course, fallen apart. I believe ATR, though, of Italy was able to still deliver some planes within the deals that they had signed, but other deals have fallen apart, essentially. Will Europe do what's best for Europe, or will it remain, essentially, the American lapdog in this issue?
Okay, that's a very good question, but let me just emphasize in the beginning that when we're talking about the EU and European Union politics or European politics, EU is not actually the main actor. So we shouldn't expect, major differences or initiatives by the new senior administrators from the EU. So it doesn't really matter who is actually the president of the European Commission, the Parliament. It is the three main players in the European Union politics that they are actually the drivers of, if there is not such a thing as a common European foreign policy. So, like you said, yes, there are actually many economic interests for the European common market, that there are many opportunities for opening and lifting the sanctions to Iran. But unfortunately, this is the big question. For the last few decades, Europe actually is struggling to articulate an independent policy, an independent foreign policy, independent from actually U.S. interest in the region. So the division actually is being illustrated the last few weeks, actually, with some condemnation by foreign ministers from various countries in Europe. But if this condemnation, they will move from rhetoric to actual actions, it is really, really doubtful.
Indeed.
No one is expecting, not even Britain, not even France and Germany to actually take a more independent stance from the US.
Indeed. All right, we'll leave there as a word, but of course we appreciate both of our guests for their time and insight. Of course, Ilia, they're speaking to us from Aberdeen, and Antonio is speaking to us there from Rome, both speaking to us via Skype. Now, it's interesting, of course, that we honed in on what Europe's role in all of this is, because even for the Iranians, in fact, this deal can be saved if the Europeans were to grow a spine, essentially, as the Iranians, I'm sure, would say, and would stand up for this deal and actually guarantee that the benefits which Iran was promised under this deal would be safeguarded and would actually be given to the Iranians. We'll keep a very close eye on that. Tomorrow, July 7th, is key to be a key date to be watching at this point in time. What happens from that date beyond is essential for not just the peace and security of this region, but essentially really of the world, because escalation with Iran would not be like escalation with any other country in this region. We'll keep a close eye on that. I'll be back, though, with our next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss an interesting piece of news that is not new news necessarily, but the GCHQ, which is essentially UK intelligence, continues to actively recruit for what it calls our covert online operators. Now, this is not new because back as early as 2015, there was already talk about this sort of thing with Edward Snowden's revelations that at that time there's a unit within the JCHQ called Joint Threat Research Intelligence Group, which essentially, for lack of a better term, actually hires trolls to go online and to essentially advocate for Britain online and to essentially, in many ways, divert conversations, deflect conversations, etc. And this is not done, by the way, just in the UK or by the British government, but has been proven to be done by Canada's intelligence agency, CSIS, or even US intelligence, be it NSA, DHS, or otherwise. So let's discuss this further, because this obviously has huge implications for all of us who use social media and are online a lot. We're joined now by Vasco de Cruz Amador, who is a founder and CEO of the Global Intelligence Insight, which is a London-based cyber intelligence project. He's also a former intelligence officer himself. He's joining us now from Lisbon. Vasco, as always, thanks for joining us here in Scope. What do you make of all this, Vasco? Certainly, it's not a new conversation. I'm sure that's been happening even within the intelligence community. But then for the rest of us, this, again, just reminds us that who we may be speaking with or who may be commenting on our public posts online may not be who they say they are. That's sort of discomforting, isn't it?
Well, thanks for having me, Waqar. It's always a pleasure. So, going straight to the topic that you just had it. If we are going to think about online troll or online trolling, it's going to be complex, and it's going to be the bad and the bad path in order to go through to fulfill what government agencies and mostly everyone is looking to prevent and to protect. But at the same time, I can add that probably it's a bit of a lack of understanding between this issue. And why? Because first of all, I'm not saying that that I'm a fan of it, because it's totally against the law. Okay, but the big problem is we are living in an era of big data. So big data is everything. So and at the same time, what we need to do is exactly to fulfill the activities and to understand well where exactly we need to go straight to prevent illicit actors, for instance, or terrorists. And we are not only speaking about Islamic terrorists, we are speaking at the same level and at the same time about right-wing extremists who lives on their own and actually lives on their safe haven within the internet, which is going to be the right place where they bypass all the information. So, meaning like we really need online and cyber intelligence analysts in order to cover these hard topics. But at the same time, we need to fulfill exactly the law and the legislation in order to monitor and to gather the right information. At least it's complex, and probably we will stay for a long time. I leave it to you.
Yeah, no, Vasco, as you said, it's complex, and I completely understand that, because I imagine then, for those of us who just the internet and what happens online on their face value, it seems we're all having these very organic discussions online. We're having these organic comments appearing, but probably that may not be very well the case. But in a scenario where you pretty much have every world government that wants to take over the narrative online, or to correct the narrative, or to secure themselves, it's essentially almost like a soft narrative war that is occurring, right? So when it comes to the internet, and that, I imagine, complicates the issue even further, because every country, every nation, even those who are allied together, probably obviously have, at many times, conflicting interests about narratives, don't they?
Yes, it's totally true. And at the first stage, everyone is looking for, at the first level, what's going on across the internet, because it's not only the internet. It's not going to be the weapon that is going to be used by illicit actors and terrorists, but actually the private sector nowadays, and the topics of geopolitics are totally linked up across the internet. So everyone is going towards, at the first moment, at the first stage, running towards the internet in order to gather the right information on the right time, which actually was the opposite like 20 years ago or 25 years ago. Because if we need to go through anything that we will need, of course, that we will use human intelligence. And the big problem nowadays is we need to interact and we need to apply when we are speaking in regards to a government agency. We need to apply the same methodologies from human intelligence, but applied straight and strict to the cyber perspective. In order to go through, if we will feel that something is going to be wrong on that topic, so probably on that time we can move on, and then we can monitor in a different way in order to protect national security interests, and so on and so on. So going and using online trolls, it's not going to be the right path because it's totally wrong, and it will leave us to the wrong path of the way of dealing, which is much more complex than this one.
But then, to be fair, Vasco, it seems that the UK and GQ are quite open, actually, about what they're looking for. Because, even the requirements for the job of a covert online operator are essentially, they've been, if for lack of a better word, dumbed down. Because, obviously, anybody who were to go into work in intelligence, such as yourself or others, would need to be obviously quite qualified for any such position. But it seems the qualifications when it comes to this specific position or positions like this, and I imagine this is the case for Canada or America or any other government that does this sort of thing, are quite dumbed down, and they essentially just need somebody who's really just good online and good at arguing and debating. It's sort of worrying, though, isn't it, going forward, that this is all happening? Because, again, if you're so open, then it almost seems like these governments are sort of just laughing in our faces and saying, listen, this is just reality. Learn to deal with it.
You are totally right. And that's exactly where the problem is nowadays. So with the use of the internet, everyone, even kids after graduating university or after leaving college, they think themselves that probably they are totally ready to engage with the era that we are living with. And right, like 30 years ago, when you are applying to the intelligence sector, it's mandatory for you to have specific qualifications and to go through specific training for the area and the subject matter expertise that you are going to apply for. Yeah. And nowadays, it's a big problem because it doesn't matter for you if you can cover the topic of social media. If you are able to monitor and to work with or to play around with Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, but it's mandatory for you to have those specific qualifications in order to apply for the right job, because we are, and even nowadays, it's much more complex than we were living in the 90s, because it's much more complex, the topics, the trends, than the way that you need to understand the trend and the topic using online pattern analysis, semantic analysis, personality, what they are going to bypass at this moment. You need to have specific qualifications and training sometimes that probably it will take you more than 1 year or 6 months, totally covering that aspect. And then after that, like, for instance, the problem of the Sri Lanka attack, YouTube and the mastermind of the attacks, he was used to post incitements for over and for more than 3 years, and nobody checked that, and they have analysts. So the type of training that probably they have, they were not applying that to the straight and to the cause that probably they need to work, and this is the problem. So they are thinking that, okay, so we can hire everyone because you can cover social media, but in fact that's not the fact, unfortunately.
All right, Vasco, we'll leave it there at that. It was short and sweet, but of course, this is a very important topic, and I appreciate you taking your time out to discuss this with us so openly here in Scope. That was Vasco de Cruz Amador, who was speaking to us from Lisbon via Skype. As I said, an important topic because there are a lot of questions that come up that I wasn't able to even get to with Vasco because this is such a wide topic, of course. But, the internet was meant to be a democratic space, a space where you were able to speak openly and you were able to then get feedback, which was just as open and democratic back to you. So now we're going to doubt every conversation we're having online, really. Are we speaking to a troll who is paid by XYZ government, or are we speaking to a real person at the other end? Because we all know that for real peace to occur in the world, we need to have people-to-people contact. And if we're just talking to trolls all the time online, or a vast majority, who just have a specific agenda, Doesn't that make peace that much harder for the world? And do these intelligence agencies even realize that they may actually be making peace that much harder to achieve instead? We'll keep a close eye on that, of course, here in Scope. I'll be back with our next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. We're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. 45% of Americans say that Donald Trump should be impeached, while 53% say he should not be. That's according to a new Gallup poll that had been released on Wednesday. Gallup also noted, importantly, that support for Trump's ouster exceeds, in fact, that for Bill Clinton's ouster call, at least, throughout the Monica Lewinsky scandal, and even for Nixon's at the beginning of the Watergate controversy. I, of course, want to approach this topic from a very, careful point of view, because obviously Trump does still very much have his supporters, even through all the controversies he's been through. So to talk about all that, we're joined now by Sascha Auerbach, who is a lecturer in history at the University of Nottingham. He's joining us now from London. We're also joined by Michael Lane, who is the founder of the American Institute for Foreign Policy. He's joining us now via Skype from Washington, D.C. And we're also joined by Andrew Grossen, who is a master's candidate in U.S. politics and foreign policy at the University College Dublin in Ireland. He's previously worked for a Democrat senator, the New Zealand Labour Party, and Minnesota Democratic Party. He's joining us now from Dublin. Andrew, Michael, and Sascha, thank you all three for joining us. Michael, I'd like to start with you. I know it's been an exciting week in the U.S. recently, especially with the July 4th celebrations and the way they worked out this year. But beyond that, what would you say about this poll? Because it is interesting that though, yes, there is more support for impeachment of Trump on paper than even Clinton and Nixon, he still very much has his supporters, doesn't he?
He does. And let me separate this into two things. The first is the impeachment process. As I think most of our viewers would know, but to review, the impeachment process is an articles of impeachment bill brought forth by the House of Representatives, which requires a majority vote to advance. That may or may not actually happen. I think we're looking at maybe a 50-50 at this point for that occurring. The second part is the articles of impeachment are then referred to the Senate, where it takes 2/3 of the senators present to vote to convict and remove the president from office. There is zero chance that they're going to get 2/3, and probably zero chance they're even going to get to a majority in the United States Senate, as that is controlled by the president's party, the Republican Party. Yeah. So what we're doing here is posturing over politics. And it really is a shameful commentary, I think, on the American political system, the way we've devolved into now working out our political differences by talk of impeachment. This was not what our founding fathers thought about when they created our country and our Constitution. In fact, they made impeachment and conviction so difficult that it would hardly ever happen. And if you look at the Gallup numbers, finally, they track very, very closely with partisan affiliation. So essentially, the president's political adversaries, the Democrats, are saying, well, we don't like what he's doing, so why don't we just remove him from office through the impeachment process? That's politics, not what should be going on.
But then, Andrew, to the Democrats, Andrew, Nancy Pelosi has been, hesitant about impeachment, hasn't she? She's, I believe 81 Democrats so far, if I'm not mistaken, have called for Trump's impeachment. But she said, no, I want this to be a bipartisan case if this does go forward. What do you make of that? Do you think that she realizes that there simply isn't that sort of bipartisan support for such a move?
Yeah, and it's important to also note that there is actually one Republican congressman who's came out for impeachment. But what's also striking within that poll is the 46% of independents who would support impeachment, that they are not exactly the liberal firebrands who are just separating the president from his policies. This is an actual distinct opposition to the president and his policies or his conduct, because impeachment doesn't have to rely on just criminal cases. It can be the separation of families at the border, whether we still haven't had his tax returns. It's these sort of things that Democrats and independents are seeing as misconduct by the president, making him worthy of being removed from office. So I would disagree with Mr. Lane on that it's just settling political differences. I truly believe that this is a movement against the president, that it has severe opposition to him being in office.
All right, so Sascha, what thoughts about that? Because, I mean, one thing strikes me is that, listen, as president, shouldn't Donald Trump be president for everybody in the sense that everybody respects him? I mean, there will obviously always be those who criticize any sitting leader of any party, really. But, you know, you would imagine that the country would be more behind this president, or am I reading that too much into that, do you think?
Well, sorry. I think Michael and Andrew made excellent points. Michael's point that this is really a procedural impossibility is the most important one. So we are kind of spinning clouds. It's almost certainly not going to happen. And the only reason that the Democrats are waffling about it a little bit is because there's such grassroots support for the move. And they're afraid if they toy with the idea and make it seem like they're taking it seriously, they'll lose some of their base in the coming election. But Andrew also makes an excellent point in that if we are to look at the way the impeachment circumstances are defined, Trump has actually fits almost all three of those identified by Congress, which is improperly exceeding or abusing the powers of the office, which he has done, behavior incompatible with the function and purpose of the office, which he has certainly done. His abuse of executive powers is very clear, and misusing the office for an improper purpose or for personal gain. He's done that as well. So the odd thing is that even though procedurally there's just not the votes for it, in terms of defining the grounds in which one generally is able to impeach a president, he fits the categories.
But then Sascha, to be fair, I might just be argued, listen, 2020 is not that far away. Why not just wait till the elections, let the democratic process speak for itself?
Absolutely, and I think that's what's going to happen. But we also have to think about America as a democratic nation and the degree to which we are going to tolerate the violation of political tradition, political norms, and how are we going to deal with what we really have, which is a runaway executive, an executive that, for example, is using the Justice Department in a highly partisan manner, an executive that is undercutting our own intelligence apparatus, an executive that seems completely unhinged at times and may get us into a war. Without real justification. How is America as a society, and how is the government as a structure? How is it going to rein in the president in these extraordinary circumstances?
Michael, I'll allow you to pursue all of the above because, you know, obviously there's a lot of criticism, legitimate criticism of this president, as there is for any president who's in the White House, Michael, at any given point in time. But do you think that it's enough then to try to make that very important message known not just to Americans but the world, that this is not what America stands for?
Well, I was very interested to hear Sascha when he said, you know, how much are we going to tolerate and stand for the president violating the political norms and traditions that we have in this country. And without a doubt, President Trump is violating most of our norms and most of our traditions. But that's not an impeachable offense. Now, I say that in quotes because apparently anything is an impeachable offense. The reality is that impeachment is essentially a political process, not a legal process. And so the Democrats can move forward, or the president's political adversaries can move forward and impeach the president for anything they choose to if they don't like the color of his hair, which they've stated many times they don't. So what we really have is a look forward. And I believe that Speaker Pelosi has her eye on the political pulse very, very well. Back in the 90s, when the Republicans made the misstep of trying to impeach and remove President Clinton from office, they paid a tremendous price at the polls for it the next time around. I believe that Speaker Pelosi thinks that the conditions and terms are the same as they were back then, and that if the Democrats exceed where the American people are, they similarly will pay a huge price at the polls in 2020. She does not want that to happen. She is resisting the most extreme members of her caucus who are trying to pursue impeachment. And I would say at this point, it's a 50-50 guess as to whether or not she has actually lost control of her caucus or whether she's still leading it. Time will tell. But I believe that Speaker Pelosi has the right political view on this, even if her caucus doesn't.
Okay, so Andrew, as with any poll that's come out recently in these recent years out of the United States and about political issues, domestic politics, be it, or foreign policy sometimes as well, this division, this partisan division seems to be that much more obvious and that much more in the spotlight, doesn't it? And I wonder, for a country such as the United States, which is seen as, a free country, et cetera, to have such a divided society on any given issue, be it impeachment of Donald Trump or other such issues, be it immigration or otherwise, I imagine that's not a good thing.
No, and it really hurts the governance because we're seeing Congress being actually more divided than the average Americans are. The polarization definitely plays out more obviously on C-SPAN, watching Congress, hearing congressional members talk about impeachment. And that's what really concerns me, is that we're lacking leadership kind of in both parties that really kind of unites. It's more of an attacking against and not really playing to, as Lincoln said, our better angels. And we're kind of at this really precipice where that might go one way or the other in the next election. If Trump does get reelected again, there is that danger of furthering divides within this country, both at a very personal individual level and on a governance level.
And that's an interesting point, isn't it, Sascha? Actually, if we're looking at even support for Democrats overall within the country, if I'm not mistaken, they don't seem to be doing very well either. There seems to be this disconnect almost on the part of Democrats as well and the American people. So not only do we have this partisan division on major issues, but we also seem to have an opposition, for lack of a better word, that is also seemingly not connected with the American people. I imagine none of this sounds like very good news for the country, does it?
Well, I mean, looking at the Democratic voters right now and kind of the general political pulse of the country, which I think both Michael and Andrew had very interesting observations about, you do see this hyperpolarization, and you see extreme wings on both sides of the party. I think the real difference is that the extreme wings essentially seize control of the Republican Party, and you have the Republicans marching lockstep to Trump's policies. There's very little resistance to the Republican Party, even to his most outrageous things. In the Democratic Party, you have a different situation, which is you do have this kind of young, aggressive, highly activist wing, like AOC, like Kamala Harris, are really pushing for more progressive policies, more liberal policies. Then you have this more centrist old guard represented really by Pelosi and Joe Biden. But the one thing we should keep in mind is that the demographics and the way that popular voting has gone for the past 10 years really heavily favor the Democrats. It's only by a process of epic gerrymandering that the Republicans have been able to hold on to a lot of these state legislatures. So one of the big battles, if you say you have these state Supreme Court stepping in and redistricting a lot of these states, then you actually really see how much support there is for the Democratic Party. So I think to say that, oh, well, they're disconnected from the voters, yeah, there's not a radical, but a more progressive wing that doesn't necessarily have the following of the entire party. But I wouldn't go so far as to describe it as a disconnect. I think that the electoral numbers really favor the Democrats long term once you have redistricting.
Okay, so then, Michael, what are your thoughts on that? Because, again, I go back to my original point about a divided country, A, and B, then I would add this on that I imagine it's not good for any country to always only be leaning one way. It's good to have the conservative and liberal sort of, conversation always going on, isn't there, so that there's this balance in place?
Well, my personal view is that redistricting has been a problem for a long time. But essentially, the centrists in both parties have been gutted and removed from places of influence in their parties because of redistricting. The fact is, the vast majority of members of Congress are more in danger of being knocked out of their seats through a run to their extreme left and their extreme right in a primary than they are in terms of losing the general election to the opposition party. When you have a situation like this, it drives both parties to their extreme wings, and it creates the polarization that we see today. I would like to see redistricting reform. I would like to see something that creates centrist districts that would really control the country and sort of reduce the polarization that we see. But I see absolutely zero chance of that happening in the near term. I believe the United States is doomed towards extreme polarization for at least the foreseeable future.
All right. On that very pessimistic note, we'll have as our final word. But of course, we appreciate all of our guests for their time and expert insight. That was Michael Lane, Sascha Auerbach, and Andrew Grossen, who were speaking to us there on this important topic because, viewers, it's a divided country, and it's such a large country, and it's still seen in many quarters of the world as a superpower of the world, even the moral authority on many issues. But in such a divided country, when now you have issues of impeachment coming up, as Michael there said, is impeachment talk just political? It certainly does seem so when it comes to many, many Democrats. Nancy Pelosi, to her credit or otherwise, doesn't want to go through the impeachment process at this point because she doesn't see it as a bipartisan effort. It would be much too partisan for that to be able to go through. But that then again defines the polarization of the United States right now. Can such a divided society, where peoples are not getting along on the most basic of issues, or at least learning to agree to disagree, how can such a society go forward in the way and shape it is right now? We'll keep a close eye on that here in Scope. I'll leave it there for now, though. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.